for having me on this webinar. I want to apologize for I missed the one from 2 weeks ago. I was away at another conference, so I apologize to whoever was presenting there. Yeah, so my name is Luke. I'm on the job market this year, and this is my job market paper. So I definitely would appreciate any of your comments and questions, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing Gabriel's thoughts as well. So one of the most salient empirical facts in the economics of immigration is the wage assimilation process. That when immigrants first arrive in a new country, they tend to earn substantially lower wages than comparable native workers, and then start to close this gap as they spend time in the host economy. And typically, the literature will interpret this as immigrants arriving with lower human capital, either because they're just fundamentally less skilled, or because not all of their skills immediately transfer over to the new labor market. But then as they spend time in the new labor market, they acquire the host country specific skills that they need. And this is what accounts for that initial gap in earnings, followed by the subsequent assimilation. But there's also a lot of evidence that immigrants face barriers in the labor market other than just differences in human capital. They might face discriminatory hiring practices. They might face challenges getting their foreign credentials recognized. They might have a different network of personal contacts that gives them access to different types of jobs. And so it's not really clear to what extent this inequality that we observe is a story of immigrants having lower skills, lower human capital, versus facing barriers that sort of hinder or distort the allocation of their labor. And throughout this project, we're going to think of an allocational barrier as sort of anything that hinders an immigrant from finding employment and from soaring across jobs the same way as a native worker of the same ability. And so this is what my project is about. Sort of have three research questions that kind of build on each other. The first one, which is the main one, is asking, like, what is the relative importance of human capital versus allocational barriers for understanding and explaining immigrant native labor market inequality? And then secondly, if these allocational barriers are important, how important are they? Like, what would be the aggregate effect on, say, output or immigrant wages if we were to eliminate these barriers and allow immigrants to allocate more optimally? And for example, what would be the implications on native workers if we were to do this? Like, what are the general equilibrium effects of this? And then three, given that eliminating all of these barriers might not be feasible in practice, how well do like standard immigrant integration programs like language training or active labor market policies do in terms of addressing the barriers that immigrants face? To do this, I'm going to begin with a detailed analysis of immigrants in the labor market using matched employer-employee tax file data from Canada. And I'm going to start by documenting some new facts, some new gaps between immigrants and natives that sort of characterize the immigrant labor market experience. And I'm going to find that immigrants not only differ in wages, they also work in very different types of firms. They have different sorting patterns across firms. They differ in terms of labor market dynamics. And then I'm going to use all of these things to develop and estimate a structural model, a search model of the labor market that's going to feature referral networks, which are going to serve as a conduit of job information, and immigrant assimilation. And I'm going to find that immigrants do arrive with lower human capital. I sort of need that to explain the data, but they also have lower returns to job search. They have higher job instability in the sense that they lose their jobs more frequently. And they have a poorer network of personal contacts in the sense that their contacts tend to be allocated into lower productivity, lower paying firms. And so that's where immigrants will tend to get more job information from. And I find that these allocational barriers have significant implications for both inequality and aggregate output. So for example, if we were to eliminate all of these barriers, these sort of allocative differences between immigrants and natives, we would increase immigrant contribution to output by more than 8% and total output by more than 1%. And that's without actually making immigrants themselves more productive. It's just improving their allocation across the labor market. Relative to the literature, so there's a big literature spanning almost 5 decades documenting that immigrants arrive facing this sort of earnings penalty and start to close it over time. I think the seminal work is Chiswick's 1978 JPE paper. And since then, other work has documented that immigrants differ in other ways, evidence that they face discrimination, that they sort in different kinds of firms. I'm going to document some new facts on immigrants in the labor market, and I'm going to exploit the sort of rich nature of my administrative data to document not only wages, but sorting patterns, labor market dynamics, how these gaps evolve over time, how they look across the firm distribution to get a more comprehensive portrait of the ways in which immigrants and natives differ. I'm also going to contribute to the more structural literature looking at immigrant inequality. A lot of these papers are excellent, but they don't model the way in which workers find employment or the barriers that immigrants might face in particular in doing so. And my framework is going to complement all this work by explicitly modeling how workers search across heterogeneous firms and micro-founding the types of barriers that immigrants might face in doing that. Relative to the search model literature, models on labor market models, I'm going to be taking a search model with productivity heterogeneity in both workers and firms, and I'm going to be embedding into this job finding through referrals, through workers' personal context, and explicitly modeling endogenous immigrant assimilation. I don't know if you guys can see this. There's this bar at the bottom that I can't seem to get rid of. So hopefully it's not impeding your view of the slide, but I can't seem to get rid of it. Okay, so the data that I'm using, I'm just going to describe the data before getting into the empirical analysis. So I'm going to be using matched employer-employee tax file data on the universe of workers and firms in Canada from 2001 to 2019. And this data is going to give me worker IDs and firm IDs matched together, annual labor income for every job, and then some basic worker and firm level characteristics like two-digit industries, province, age, sex, and importantly, monthly job start and end dates, which is going to allow me to create spell data. And then this data then merges with detailed immigrant landing data for every permanent resident to Canada since 1980. And what this data is going to allow me to do is going to allow me to identify which workers in the tax file data are immigrants, when they arrived, whether they're permanent residents or temporary, their country of origin, and what channel of entry they arrived at. Did they arrive through the economic channel, through the point system, or are they a refugee, are they a family member, et cetera? It's really, really rich data and it's uniquely suited to study my question. I'm going to follow the literature. I'm going to define immigrants throughout the analysis as permanent residents who land at age 16 or older. So if you're a permanent resident and you land as a child, I'm going to group you with native workers for the analysis. And after some basic sample restrictions, we're going to have about 180 million observations, about 20% of which are going to be immigrants. So Canada is a very high immigrant receiving country, and about 20% of the labor force are going to be permanent residents who landed as adults. The first fact, so I'm going to show you four facts, four empirical facts about immigrants and natives in the labor market. The first fact is that they have substantial gaps in terms of both wages and firm types. And so in this graph here, on the left y-axis, we're going to have the log gap of immigrants relative to comparable native workers, and we're going to be using a within worker assimilation regression. So this is sort of the average within worker trajectory, which sort of nets out compositional changes due to, for example, selective return migration or changing cohort quality over time. And so what we see is that when immigrants first arrive, they tend to earn about 60 log points less than a comparable native worker, and then start to close this gap over time. So by 10 years in Canada, the gap closes to about 25 log points. By 20 years in Canada, it closes to about 15 log points. The rest of the lines highlight that immigrants also work in very different types of firms. In the green line, we have the log value added per worker, which is like a measure of productivity for the worker's employer, so this says that when immigrants first arrive, they work at firms about 40 log points lower value added per worker, and then start climbing into higher productivity firms over time. The red line is the mean log pay at the firm, so they work at firms that are sort of fundamentally lower paying and then climb into higher paying firms over time. The triangle markers is an alternative way of ranking firms by a revealed preference approach, and so it basically uses worker flows to rank firms. And the general idea is, if I'm a firm that's sort of systematically poaching workers from other firms, my firm is going to be sort of superior in some sense. It's revealed to be superior. And so that firm is going to get a higher rank. And this is going to be actually a model consistent way of ranking firms by productivity. And I'm going to use it in the analysis and also to estimate the structural model. But the key takeaway here is that immigrants earn lower wages, they sort into lower productivity firms, and then they climb up over time. And the key motivational graph for the project, right? The key question is why do we observe this? Why is it that immigrants earn such lower wages and sort into such lower productivity firms? In principle, this could entirely be explained by differences in human capital. Immigrants are lower skilled, so they optimally settle into sort of lower skill, lower productivity jobs. But then as they accumulate the skills that they need, they are able to find better and better jobs, and this is what accounts for this entire figure. Alternatively, it could also be due to allocational barriers. Immigrants face discrimination. They would be, an excellent engineer, but their foreign credentials from, India or wherever they're from are not recognized by firms, and so they drive a taxi until they can sort of figure these things out. And it's not clear from this figure alone which of those two explanations it is. And so this is what's going to motivate looking at the other ways in which immigrants and natives differ in the labor market, and then the development of a structural model that can use all of these facts to disentangle these competing explanations. So the second fact is that immigrants obtain jobs more slowly out of unemployment. This is the assimilation profile in quarterly unemployment to employment transition rate. So on the y-axis, we have the native average in the dashed line. So this says about 31% of native workers who enter employment are going to exit employment within 3 months. For immigrants, when they first arrive, they actually look very similar to native workers, but then a gap sort of emerges in the first couple of years before slowly starting to converge. And in the model, I don't want to get into it too much, but in the model, it's going to be explained by immigrants searching for work more intensively when they first arrive. You can think of that as they're more ambitious, or maybe they face constraints like not having unemployment benefits or something that motivates them to search more intensively. As those things wear off, other barriers like discrimination are going to prevent them from finding work as intensively. Interestingly, this cannot be explained by seemingly anything other than the fact that they are immigrants. So in the first gray line, we're going to add controls for detailed job level characteristics, including the industry of employment, percentiles in the firm's rank, wage, and size, and the workers' pay decile within the firm. And the last one is trying to control for, like, say, differences in occupation. And so what that line says, the fact that the gap doesn't close, it says that even immigrants and natives who had very, very similar jobs prior to entering unemployment, immigrants still transition out of unemployment much more slowly relative to native workers. Additionally, controlling for their tenure at the firm or their total potential Canadian experience doesn't explain these gaps. It does seem to be sort of like a fundamental immigrant-native dichotomy. The third fact is that immigrants have higher job turnover. So I'm going to plot side by side differences in employment to employment and employment to unemployment transition rates. And so on the left figure, I wish I could point. This is my first time presenting on a Zoom. It's way harder than presenting in person. On the left figure, on the y-axis, you have the annual employment to employment transition rate. So for native workers, it's about 14%. Says that on average, an employed native worker is going to move to another firm within a year. Similarly, about 10% of native workers are going to exit their current job and go into unemployment within a year. The black line then plots the gap between immigrants and natives, and then how that gap changes with time as a permanent resident in Canada. And so what you see is that when immigrants first arrive, they have like 70% higher employment to employment transition rate and about 100% higher employment to unemployment transition rate. So they're much more mobile out of their jobs. If we add those job level controls, it kind of explains some of this, but not all of it. So a lot of these gaps exist even among jobs that are really, really similar, which says that they're not being driven, at least not entirely, by immigrants, say, sorting into industries or occupations that sort of have inherently high job turnover rates. If we plot this across the firm distribution, it's interesting because in principle, you could imagine that this is due to immigrants allocating away from, say, lower productivity, lower ranked jobs. But if we plot this across the firm rank distribution, so here the x-axis is not time in Canada, but firm decile. So on the left side, you have like low productivity firms. On the right side, you have high productivity firms. Immigrants are systematically more mobile all the way across the firm distribution, even out of the high productivity firms, out of the high productivity jobs. The thing that actually ends up explaining this is job tenure. And so what this says is immigrants are very mobile compared to native workers. So if you compare like a 40-year-old immigrant who just arrived in Canada compared to a 40-year-old native worker, immigrants are way more mobile out of their job. They have a lot higher job turnover. But if you compare a 40-year-old immigrant to a 40-year-old native who was also just displaced from their job, they actually look very much the same. And so this seems to be less of like, firms are just sort of systematically firing immigrant workers, and more of, last in, first out firing policies, where firms are sort of systematically firing the most junior employee, whether they're immigrant or native. And so what this seems to be is it sort of seems to be sort of natural process that happens when, by nature, if you're migrating to a new country, you have to leave your old job behind, you have to start over, and there's a sort of turnover process as you're settling into a suitable job. The final fact is that immigrants have really strong ethnic sorting patterns. And so this is a regression that's going to capture the sensitivity of the ethnic composition of new hires going to a firm relative to the ethnic composition of incumbent workers already at the firm. And when we run this regression, what we find is overall, so if you group natives and immigrants together, if you increase the share of workers at a firm of the same ethnicity as yourself by 10 percentage points, you're going to increase the share of that same country of origin of new hires going to that firm by about 6 percentage points. If you just focus on immigrants, that coefficient is about 8. It's almost 1 to 1, which says that the sorting of workers to firms is very, very sensitive to the ethnic composition of workers already at that firm. In columns 2 and 4, we additionally control for those firm level controls, so industry, percentiles, and firm pay, rank, and size. And you see that the coefficient falls slightly, which says that some of this sorting has to do with the fact that immigrants are in sort of different sectors or different types of firms, but most of it remains, which means even among firms that are really, really similar, an Indian worker will systematically gravitate towards a firm that has a high share of specifically other Indian immigrants. If we add the share of immigrants from other countries of origin, so you control for the share of, say, like Indian workers and non-Indian immigrants, immigrants don't really sort towards immigrants in general. So Indian immigrants are not really sorting toward other immigrants. The coefficient is minus 0.05 or somewhere between minus 0.05 and 0.1. They sort of entirely are sorting toward firms with other specifically Indian immigrants. And in the paper, I mentioned that these patterns are not necessarily driven by referral networks. They could potentially be driven by preferences or by productivity. But I argue that if we allow for a different ranking of firms, an immigrant-specific ranking of firms, that these patterns exist entirely within firms that immigrants themselves rank the same. So it doesn't seem to be driven by selection. And moreover, these patterns exist even for countries of origin that are culturally and linguistically very similar. So these patterns are almost just as strong for immigrants from the US and Europe, specifically from the US or from the UK, as from India, immigrants from India or from Philippines. So it doesn't seem to be driven by, I'm an Indian worker and I don't speak good English, and so I want to, go to a firm with a lot of Indian workers. We can share the same language, we share the same culture, because it exists even among immigrants that speak fluent English and have the same similar culture as in Canada. And so in the model, I'm going to interpret these as evidence of not selection but information. So we know that referral networks are an important part of job finding. Survey evidence typically finds that almost half of all jobs are found through personal contacts, through referrals, and these sort of network of referrals tend to be heavily ethnically segmented. So a survey of immigrants in Canada found that about 90% of personal contacts used for job finding were either a family member or a friend, specifically of the same ethnicity. And what I'm going to show you is that this actually has important allocative implications for the types of firms that immigrants are employed at. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the model. So the model is going to build on a random search model with two-sided heterogeneity and sorting. So specifically, I'm building on background length, and I'm going to explicitly embed immigrant assimilation and referral networks. And so the basic setup is that you're going to have an economy populated by a mass of workers and firms. Workers and firms are going to be heterogeneous in their productivity type, X and P. Workers are going to choose how intensively to search for new work, both often on the job, and firms are going to choose how intensively to recruit new workers. Once matched, the worker and firm are going to produce some output. Wages are going to be determined by match bargaining, and existing matches will eventually end when the worker finds a better job and moves voluntarily or through exogenous or involuntary shock. The key new things here are assimilation and referral networks. So I'm going to explain how those function in the model. So in addition to being heterogeneous in their productivity type, workers are also going to be heterogeneous in their origin group O and in their assimilation state A. New immigrants are going to differ from natives. So when they first arrive in the economy, they're going to differ from native workers in up to 4 respects. They're going to potentially have lower effective human capital, and this is going to affect their productivity within any given match. They're going to have higher job instability, which is going to affect the rate at which they exogenously separate from their jobs. They're going to have lower effective job search, which affects their ability to form new matches, and they're going to have a different network of personal contacts, which also affects their ability to form new matches, but in a different way, and I'll show you that in just a second. This is also like a kind of loose, high-level identification argument for how I'm identifying these different things when I take the model to the data. If we just have, say, differences in human capital, we might be able to explain differences in wages. We might be able to explain differences in the types of firms that they work at, depending on how much assortative matching there is in the model. But you'll miss facts 2 through 4. And so the sort of comprehensive picture of how they differ is going to allow me to identify all these different ways in which immigrants might struggle in the labor market. A is going to be a k-dimensional state vector that denotes the worker's assimilation state. So new immigrants, when they first arrive, they're unassimilated. They're going to have this vector equal to all zeros. Natives are going to have A equal to 1 sort of by definition. They're like assimilated by definition. And then for each dimension K, for every worker, for each dimension K for which they're unassimilated, at rate A to K, the worker is going to receive a shock that moves them to the assimilated state. You could have a finer grid, like a smoother assimilation transition. And I had this originally, but the number of combinations kind of blows up, and so it becomes computationally challenging to do this. But in the aggregate, it doesn't make a lot of difference. At the worker level, it would make a difference, but in the aggregate, it's not making a lot of difference. So we're going to focus on this binary assimilation state. Once they move to the assimilation state, AK equal 1, they're going to become like natives along that dimension. And so if they arrive with this like human capital wedge, once they assimilate in terms of human capital, they're going to be equally productive to a same type native worker. A to K can be either an exogenous process that the worker just takes as given. So you might think like the job turnover process is just something that they don't have a lot of control at, just takes time before they settle into an appropriate job. Whereas other things are going to be an endogenous choice, like human capital accumulation or overcoming search barriers or networking with natives. These are going to be endogenous choices by the worker. So referral networks. So in the model, workers are going to be connected to some network of personal contacts. This network is going to be exogenous, and it's going to be segmented by origin. So I'm an immigrant. I land in Canada. My personal contacts, my people are the other immigrants of the same origin as myself. Over time, I'm going to be able to network with native workers and eventually join their network, have access to native contacts. And the reason I might want to do this is that networks in the model are going to serve to transmit job information through referrals. So I don't just search for work bilaterally with firms that have open vacancies. I also find out job information through my personal contacts. Workers can therefore find jobs through 3 main channels. They can find them formally, which you should think of this as like online job search or like responding to newspaper advertisements. It's like a bilateral meeting between a worker and a firm. But I can also find jobs through 2 different types of referrals. You have business referrals, which is when a worker who is employed at some firm of type P passes a vacancy information at that firm to their contact. So firms can basically choose to they're going to post vacancies. They can choose to just wait until a searching worker finds that, but they can also apply effort to disseminate that job information through their personal contacts. And so the incumbent employees at a firm become a source of job information. The other kind of referral is a personal referral. And this is a worker who's employed at some other firm Q, and this firm is better than P, and therefore this worker doesn't want to take that job information for themselves. They don't want to move to that job. In a standard search model, that worker would just discard that information. In this model, they're going to be able to pass that information with some probability onto their personal contact. And both of these types of referrals are prevalent in survey data, and they're going to be important for explaining the ethnic sorting patterns across the firm distribution. So in the model, business referrals will be associated with higher productivity firms, personal referrals will be associated with lower productivity firms, and you need both to sort of explain the sorting patterns across the firm range distribution. Workers are going to apply effort S to find new work, and their total job finding rate, conditional on that effort, their employment status, and their type, is going to be lambda bar. Now, just to quickly explain this, zeta is going to be the effective search technology, and tau is going to be like a wedge that can minimize or amplify that. I'm going to normalize tau S to be 1 for native. So zeta is like the native search technology. It dictates, conditional on my search effort, S, how quickly I find new work. For immigrants, this tau S is going to be estimated from the data. And the way you should think about this is tau S affects the number of job offers I get conditional on how intensively I'm searching for new work. And so this is going to pick up things like discrimination, firms, looking at my resume and seeing that my education is from India, not knowing how to process that and just discarding that in favor of a native worker. Or you could also think of more formal barriers like occupational licenses. I have good education. I would be a very productive nurse or engineer, but I don't have the license to actually perform that occupation, so I'm barred from doing so until I overcome that barrier. Lambda hat, on the other hand, is going to be an equilibrium object that determines how quickly I find work at a type P firm, conditional on my effective search, which is a combination of tau and zeta. And the reason why this object depends on your assimilation state and your origin is going to be because of segmented referral networks. So if it wasn't for segmented referral networks, this thing would just depend on P, but this is going to be another reason why the job arrival function for immigrants is going to look different than native workers. And in particular, in equilibrium, you can show that this lambda hat term is equal to the formal job finding rate, lambda F, times 2 network-specific multiplier terms that arise from both the presence of business referrals and personal referrals. Now, both of these terms are greater or equal to 1, which says that networks are kind of a good thing in the model. They facilitate the flow of job information. They make matches happen more frequently. The key is that they're network specific. And in particular, both of these terms are going to depend on the search behavior and the employment distribution of my personal contacts. And so the key here is, like we saw that immigrants tend to be sorted into these lower productivity, lower ranked firms. If all of my personal contacts are just other immigrants who are downshifted in the firm distribution, then that's the kind of job information that they're going to be able to provide for me. And so what you'll get in the model is an otherwise identical immigrant and native worker are going to have differential access to job information because their personal contacts are different and because their personal contacts are allocated differently in the labor market. And what I'm going to show you in just a second is that this actually amplifies differences in the sorting between immigrants and native workers. So that's a high level view of the model. I skipped value functions, etc. for time, but I'd be happy to show you those if anyone's wondering. Now I'm going to turn to the quantitative analysis. So I estimate this model to the data. It fits the data moments really well. And one of the cool things is that without targeting this, it fits the gaps in firm types very well. So remember, I showed you in that graph differences in poach rank, differences in firm pay, differences in firm value added per worker. It sort of naturally captures those quite well, which makes me confident that the sort of micro foundations that are inducing these sorting differences between immigrants and natives are reasonable. So the first exercise that we're going to do is we're going to decompose what drives differences in sorting between immigrants and natives. So remember, it could be human capital, low skilled workers, just optimally sort into lower skilled jobs, or it could be these allocative barriers, right? I'm a very productive worker. I'm having a harder time finding employment than a native worker. And what we're going to do, so the bottom line here in square markers, it's the baseline assimilation profile in terms of firm productivity. From there, we're going to systematically start shutting down the other ways in which immigrants and natives differ. So the first chunk is we're going to shut down segmented referral networks. So referral networks still function, but now immigrants and natives share the same personal context. Then we're going to remove these differences in search barriers. So there's no more discrimination. There's no more, firms just choosing not to hire immigrant workers because they can't assess their credentials. The third chunk is we're going to remove differences in exogenous separation rates. And then the final chunk is removing differences in human capital. And what we see, the first takeaway from this graph, is that networks persistently amplify gaps in firm sorting. They account for about a quarter to a third of total immigrant native inequality along this dimension. And it's persistent in the sense that, it seems like immigrants kind of overcome these other barriers with time. So if you look at the right end of the graph, after 10 years in Canada, they sort of search barriers, job instability, sort of less of a big deal. But networks is persistent. And that's because these ethnic sorting patterns are really persistent, which in the model interprets it as social assimilation is slow. So even 10 years after landing, I still am sort of very attached to the immigrant network. My contacts are immigrants, and it sort of continues to prevent me from allocating higher up in the firm ladder. We can do this decomposition the other way in reverse order by first shutting down differences in human capital and job instability, and then finally networks at the end. And it looks similar, with one notable exception, that networks no longer explains almost anything. And this highlights that networks serve to amplify job information, amplify inequality between immigrants and natives. If you first shut down differences in human capital, differences in search barriers, differences in job instability, now immigrant and native network are essentially the same. And so removing the segmentation doesn't do much. It's the fact that immigrants differ in these other ways that now, if you segment their referral networks, inequality effectively becomes exacerbated. But the key here is that these allocative barriers explain about half of the gap in firm sorting. So in that first graph that I showed you of immigrant sorting into lower productivity firms, half of that is not explained by differences in skills. It's explained by these other differences between immigrants and natives. If we now look at turn to wages, so eliminating these allocative barriers is going to allow immigrants to climb higher up the firm ladder. Okay, so what is their effect on wages? And this is less of a straightforward exercise because the removing these allocative barriers has both an intensive and an extensive margin. For workers who were already employed, it's going to allow them to move up the firm distribution, obtain higher wages. And what I find is that across the distribution of immigrants, every type of immigrant, their wages are going to go up. But the mean wage is ambiguous, and that's because it's also inducing an extensive margin response. So immigrants are not only reallocating up the firm ladder, they're also reallocating from unemployment to employment. And in the model, high-skilled immigrants are doing quite well compared to same ability native workers. It's the low-skilled immigrants that are struggling the most. And that's because high-skilled immigrants can endogenously assimilate faster and search for work more intensively to overcome the barriers that they face. So it's the low-skilled immigrants that are doing the worst. So when we remove these barriers, they have the biggest response. And so you have effectively a bunch of low-skilled workers who were unemployed now entering unemployment. And this changes the composition of immigrants in the labor market. And so again, on the square markers, we have the baseline wage assimilation profile. The first line, the line in circle markers, is the change in mean wage, which is going to include both changes in individual wages and changes in the composition. And you see that wages go up on average, but then it sort of flattens out, and the effect actually becomes negative. And all of that is because of this changing composition of immigrants. If you net that out and you just focus on the within worker effect, we see that wages rise initially and they sort of continue to stay high. So eliminating these allocated barriers is going to account for about a quarter of total immigrant native inequality. If we decompose that within component, as we did before, a lot of it is coming from these differences in search barriers, and not a lot of it is coming from networks. If we now turn from decomposing this to understanding what the aggregate implications are, in this table, what we're doing is in the first 3 lines, we're going to be removing network segmentation, search barriers, job instability, and then in the 4th line, we're going to remove all of them simultaneously, so all of the allocative barriers. What we see is that removing all of these allocative barriers has a big employment response. It increases immigrant employment by about 6.2 percentage points. Again, a lot of that's coming from lower skill immigrants, and so the effect on mean output per worker is actually negative. Same thing with mean wages. The net effect is actually negative, and all of that's coming from this changing composition. If we focus on the within worker output, it raises individual output by about 2.5%, mean wages by almost 5%, and importantly, it's going to increase immigrants' contribution output by about 8.5%. That's coming from a combination of allowing workers to reallocate up to higher productivity firms, and also from workers who were unemployed finding employment. Importantly, helping immigrants does not crowd out native workers, and the reason is that helping immigrants has a competitive effect on native workers, in the sense that now immigrants can navigate the labor market more efficiently. They're going to find jobs, and that has a sort of negative competitive effect on immigrants. But firms are also endogenously responding to this new environment, and now that it's less costly to find suitable immigrant labor, they're going to optimally start creating more jobs, and which native workers can benefit from. And so it's theoretically ambiguous what kind of effect this would have on native workers, and it turns out that those two effects sort of net each other out, so that the net effect on native workers is quite negligible. And so in this project, I document new empirical facts about immigrants in the labor market, and I use these facts to develop and estimate a structural model of immigrant labor market integration. My main findings are that immigrants do face these barriers that distort their allocation of labor. These barriers have big aggregate implications. If we could eliminate them, we'd raise their output by about 8%, largely by helping unemployed, low-skilled immigrants enter the labor market. And I thought this was kind of an interesting policy insight, because in a world of scarce resources and where governments need to sort of target their integration efforts, it should be towards this demographic of immigrants. Doing this has negligible effects on native workers due to this offsetting effects of competition and job creation. And then finally, something that I didn't get to show today is I'm mapping feasible integration programs, specifically labor market, language training, and active labor market policies to the model parameters to assess how effective these are at addressing these barriers. And I find that they can achieve similar aggregate output gains largely by tackling differences in human capital rather than these allocated barriers. So I'm done, and I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Gabriel.
Okay, Luke, thanks a lot for a wonderful presentation, an amazing paper, amazing model, and of course the presentation also very nice. Now we give the floor to Gabriel Chavez Bosch, which is going to discuss the paper by 10 minutes, after which we're going to continue with, you can, Luke, comment after the discussion, the comments, and then we can open the floor for the people in the panelist group that want to participate. So, Gabriel, the floor is yours, and you can start your discussion.
Okay, so can you hear me well? Can you see the slides? Okay, so well, I was tasked with the very difficult job of discussing this paper, not because the model is complicated, but because it's a great paper. The contribution is very relevant to multiple subfields of the immigration, assimilation, and search models. And on top of that, it's very polished. It's a very nice read as well, so thank you. Okay, let me hide the floating meeting controls, and okay, let's start. So the way that I'm going to discuss this is more trying to understand how different things could be maybe framed in a way to improve readability by a person that first reads this paper and has some questions. So I've been focusing on, what are my first impressions, what comes to mind, rather than criticizing any methods or model which are already quite polished, and a lot of the questions that might come up actually are answered in the paper. So first of all, overall comments. So I've been wondering throughout the paper how labor supply shocks fit into it. Of course, we have this obsession to try to understand how labor supply shocks affect natives, how immigration-induced labor supply shocks affect natives. But of course, as Luke mentioned, something that is very important is to understand how immigrants integrate into the country. But at the same time, these labor supply shocks or these inflows of immigrants, they affect immigrants themselves. So I'm wondering what is the role of such phenomena in this paper. So does the size of these immigration inflows matter for the results? You know, it's not the same having one immigrant with a given set of skills going to Whitehorse, for instance, than 1,000 immigrants with a similar set of skills going to Toronto. The second set of immigrants might have a harder time finding a job, they might have lower salaries. So how does these considerations affect potentially the results? Empirically, this might entail controlling for some local labor market trends, for instance. In the model, I don't see clearly how that's modeled. So maybe it will be good to mention a little bit what are the potential implications? Do we need to care? What are also the other potential labor market conditions that matter for assimilation? So we have research showing that unemployment upon arrival has an impact on the trajectory of assimilation, for instance. So should we care about this? Then I think in the presentation, um, it was not referenced. I mean, we had this firm rank classification into 10 quartiles. This comes from Bagger-Lens poaching rate measure that basically calculates how many immigrants from one firm go to another firm to calculate a poaching rate for each firm, and this is used to calculate the rank distribution. And I was wondering why not use the AKM style reveal preference as in Sorkin. You have another paper in which you do that, look. So I wonder what is the choice to use the Wagner Lens paper instead of the AKM. I feel that the AKM maybe it's more widely used, but maybe the results are very similar. Maybe it's better for the estimation of the model to use the poaching rate measure. I will just try to understand or see more substantiated each choice. Um, then there's this whole discussion about human capital barriers versus non-human capital barriers. The paper makes a lot of emphasis in non-human capital barriers because arguably that's one of the main contributions, and I think that's extremely relevant as well. But I think I lacked, or at least when I was reading, I was missing a little bit more about what's the relevance of each one of them. Of course, at the end, when you do your counterfactual simulations, you have results for all of these, but I still felt like it could have a little bit more of discussion in the paper. Okay, then I'm gonna go over empirical and model. So this non-monotonic profile of unemployment to unemployment simulation that you mentioned is interesting. You mentioned something about how unemployment benefits could play into this. However, in the paper, you say that the model attributes this to offsetting dynamics of the cost and barriers of job search. I'm quoting literally from the paper. I still would like to know a little bit more, even just from economic theory, what should we interpret this or just by example? And then, since the model does not really consider heterogeneity by origin subgroup, you have immigrants and natives. Some of the results in the paper, you didn't present them in the presentation, so maybe that's aligned with this common. Some of the results in the paper separate by origin and also motive of migration, economic, non-economic. And there doesn't seem to be lots of differences across these subgroups. So should we move these results to the appendix? I think that personally, I will find it a little bit easier to have a little bit less results in the empirical section and focus on some of the main facts that's what you did in the presentation. So I think that translating that logic to the paper or just moving some results to the appendix might be good for improving the flow. And then you have this new hire to incumbent share. You showed I think you didn't show exactly this figure in the presentation, but basically you have the the ranks and then what's the correlation within each rank. in terms of the new higher to incumbent share and these ethnic composition correlations. It's quite flat. So I'm wondering whether this implies that there's limit sorting viability. And is this immigrant sorting into low productivity driven more by network presence than by productivity difference? You mentioned part of this in the presentation, but I think in the paper it didn't struck me to be as clear. I was left wondering a little bit how to interpret that figure and this sort of flat relationship. When it comes to the model, one part that at the beginning, I think I didn't understand exactly how it plays out a role in the model is this heterogeneity in ability by immigrants. So you have, well, by immigrants and natives. So everybody, each person in this model has an ability X between 0 and 1. I don't understand why you need that in the model. I think it makes it maybe more general, but maybe a little bit complicated. Does it improve the fit? I would like to potentially know what is the main reason to include this. Then when you present the model, you go more general with multiple origins, but then at the end, when you actually implement the estimation of the model, you just say, okay, there's native and immigrants. And I found it if we end up just partitioning the groups of people into natives and immigrants, maybe you will need to be general with the multiple origins. I think that also will improve readability. Then something that it was not quite clear is how is the relative size of immigrants and native chosen? Is this just given in the data? You take, I don't know, 20% of working age people are permanent residents, you take that and that's it. Does it matter what is the relative size too? Finally, this is quite a specific comment, so maybe it doesn't matter that much, but you say that you simulate 19 years of employment histories and keep the last 10. I don't understand why this approach. How do immigrant inflows enter the model? Is this relevant or not? I was wondering that, but again, this is more specific to the paper, so maybe that doesn't matter much. And then there's still a big role for human capital differences throughout the paper. Your contribution, I will say, it's more on these new networks and referrals, which it's quite impressive the way that you put it into the model, to be honest. So that's very cool. But I'm still left wondering, especially in the policy part, because you have all these labor market policies, integration, language, active labor market policies. How does this inform discussion about what type of policies are more desirable? So I don't want to be devil's advocate and say that selective immigration policies might be more desirable or the normative, given that still human capital preferences matter a lot. But I think it will be also interesting to understand how selective immigration policies as being the main way that human capital differences can be changed, the inflow of immigrants by skill, for instance, can be changed vis-a-vis integration policies that takes immigration as a given, right? You have a distribution of people and you go exactly as you say in the paper to these more low-skilled, possibly unemployed and try to integrate them. So what does your model say about one side of policies or the other, whether we should spend more on integration, whether selection maybe it's more desirable from economic output point of view? Of course, here I'm just trying to be positive rather than normative. And I think that, you made a great investment in this model. So maybe this is a question that you can investigate down the line 1 minute. And I'm finished, to be honest. So that's great. So maybe that's directions for future research. Maybe that's something that you want to say more. And just leaving it there and hopefully it helps. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading the paper and discussing it. And I hope that this entices some further discussion. Thank you all.
Hello, Gabriel. Now, Luke, you might answer the comments of Gabriel, and then we can briefly open the floor for people if they want to make extra questions.
Yes, I would love to. So Gabriel, thank you first of all so much for reading and for that was a very detailed discussion of my paper. I was trying to write everything down. I'll get the slides from you after. I'm going to try and answer as many things as I can. So the first comment was about labor supply shocks. So the short answer is that, so you asked whether the size of inflows will matter or the labor market conditions would matter. The answer is yes. they do matter. In an earlier version of this paper, I had a setup that could accommodate aggregate shocks, even though there is two-sided heterogeneity in workers and firms. But that required setting more restrictions on the wage determination process that led to sort of unsatisfying wage dynamics. And so to allow for like the sort of richer wage setting structure, to then try and put in aggregate dynamics becomes intractable. This is actually like a really well-known problem in random search models with two-sided heterogeneity, that it's accommodating aggregate dynamics. So, you know, business cycle fluctuations or aggregate shocks of any kind typically becomes intractable. And so while I don't think that those are very interesting questions, it's sort of like a limitation of the class of model that I'm using, that I just can't accommodate those things yet. But I would like to. So I'm paying attention to the development of this literature. I think people are working on this. You asked about why I rank firms the way that I do. So there's sort of two other ways to rank, for like common ways to rank firms. One is Sorkin's. It's like I think it's a page rank. He sort of developed something that's it's not quite like AKM. It's a bit different. It's also, I think, based on worker flows. I think you would get something similar. His is more is a more involved thing to estimate, and I'm not sure whether it's like exactly model consistent. The ranking system that I'm using is really easy to calculate, which is helpful when I'm estimating the model, because I have to simulate the data and calculate these things like millions of times to estimate the model. So simpler is better, and it's model consistent. AKM basing firms rank on like on the wage data is not model consistent. They're highly correlated. This rank and the AKM rank are highly correlated. But again, I opt for this because A, it's model consistent, and B, it's really simple to calculate. Like calculating AKM is a more involved thing, and it'll slow down the computation of the model. You asked about moving subgroups to the appendix. I agree. That was the case originally, and then everyone was asking me, well, what about, you know, immigrants of different types? And so I listened to them. Maybe that was foolish. I might move it to the appendix. We'll see. We'll see what the vote is. The unemployment to employment wage dynamics. So you sort of asked for a bit more. I agree. So basically, the lower cost of job search is going to be partially identified using the high employment to employment transition rate. And then the gap in UE transition rate, net of everything else, is going to determine like these search barriers. And so the offsetting dynamics of those two things is sort of going to naturally produce this sort of U-shaped assimilation profile. And I think it's reasonable. I think that it would be weird that the barriers you face accumulate with time. It seems to me like their unemployment to employment transition rates are likely close to natives when they arrive, because they're searching really intensively. Maybe they don't have, you know, the savings or something to stay in unemployment for very long, and so they need to get their hands on a job. That's sort of the interpretation that comes out of the model. I think it's reasonable. You could probably come up with plausible alternatives, and I could think more about those. You asked about ethnic sorting across the firm rank distribution and why it's flat. So again, yeah, it's hard for other people because they didn't show, but basically those ethnic sorting coefficients, you can sort of estimate that regression separately for like low rank firms all the way across. And so you sort of get like a little bit of like a hub shaped relationship. And all that says is that these sorting patterns are sort of existing all the way across the firm distribution. So high productivity firms, low productivity firms, you still see these sort of strong ethnic sorting patterns. And that profile is going to help identify the different parameters that govern referrals in the model. You asked about why there's worker heterogeneity. So that does complicate the model a lot. The reason you need that is because you need to allow for assortative matching. Like if part of that first graph, the differences in wages and difference in firm types, if I'm going to give justice to the explanation that this is driven by differences in human capital, I have to have the ability for, you know, low skill workers to sort into low productivity firms and high skill workers to sort into high productivity firms. And so I need to have basically sorting. And so yeah, it's just sort of necessary to answer the question that I'm after. Maybe like the last one I'll address before opening up to the floor. You asked why in the model, I sort of simulate for 19 years and then drop and just keep the first 10. So that's because in the data and in my simulation, the very first year, I don't know what that person's like tenure at the firm is. It's mostly to do with tenure. So I don't know how long that person's been there. And so if I move all the way up to year 2010, well, I can use the last 10 years to back out their employment histories and sort of know where they're at in their career. And that's helpful because a lot of the moments that I use are sort of conditional on tenure. And so it allows me to basically build employment histories for workers before using that chunk in the actual estimation. That's the reason.
That's going to matter more for natives, right? I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Because an immigrant, when they arrive, their tenure
is zero, right?
Yeah, their tenure is zero.
Okay, I see.
Exactly. The other reason I restrict to that time period for the model is that, as you pointed out, I have a steady state model, so I don't have a business cycle or these dynamics. And 2010 to 2019 is sort of couched in like a period of economic stability between two crises and stuff. It just makes it sort of more natural to interpret the model in that way. I probably didn't answer everything, but that's the best I can do based on my memory.
No, that's great. I mean, I assume that you might get these questions already quite a lot when you're presenting and so on. So maybe in the paper you could substantiate the way you did just now for some of these, just to avoid people wondering. Then again, you also want to strike a balance between having a paper that is too long and having a paper that is succinct. So, just some impressions as a reader of how some questions might come along, really. So if it's helpful, I'm happy. If not, well, I mean, it's okay, I guess.
No, I appreciate it. They're very helpful, and they'll definitely help me improve the writing and the flow of the paper. Thanks.
Okay. So thanks a lot both for the wonderful discussion. Let's open now briefly the floor. So to see if there is any question in the panelists, you can just raise a hand. So far in the Q&A, we don't have questions. So check. Yeah. If anyone wants to, yeah, please, Cesar.
Yeah. Hi, Luke. So first of all, very nice paper. I really liked it and enjoyed it a lot. I just have two questions, but it's more clarification again. So because in your estimations, you mentioned that you focus on that you include worker fix effects for estimating the wage gap between or the gap or the assimilation profiles between immigrants and natives. So I wonder then how you interpret the coefficients, because in principle the level is not identified, right? So you're essentially comparing the average growth between native and migrants. And would you be concerned that also, because some of the characteristics of immigrants tend to be quite persistent, that including a worker fixed effect would kind of absorb those differences? And my second question would be, because you say you focus on U2E and E2U transitions, but in many administrative data, you don't observe unemployment, but typically non-employment. So I wonder, in the Canadian data, do you observe something like unemployment benefits or registered unemployment? So what's your kind of definition of unemployment? Because people could be dropping out of the sample if they become self-employed, for example, or they leave the country, or many other reasons. So
yeah. So okay, so let me answer the second one first. So you're right that in the data, and I talk about this more in the paper. So in the data, you're right that I don't observe the labor market status of the worker. I basically observe gaps between different like employment at different firms. And so I make some sample restrictions. The most pertinent one is that I'm going to restrict attention to workers who were never non-employed for more than 2 consecutive tax file years. And so why I do that is I want to drop people who are like leaving the labor market for like different reasons, like, I can't think off the top of my head, health reasons, or, leaving the country or something. And then, letting those big non-employment spells drive the gaps in unemployment. So I drop those. And then what I get is like the mean sort of non-employment spell is roughly the same. It's a bit longer, but it's roughly the same to the mean unemployment duration that you get from the LFS. And so you're right that these are non-employment spells, but they sort of give reasonable unemployment durations in terms of transition rates, mean unemployment durations. And I do a little bit of more work to make sure that these aren't being driven by other things. So for example, the gaps between immigrants and natives, because the key is the gaps, right? The key is the gaps between immigrants and natives. They're like the profiles are almost identical whether I look at just males or just females, which says like these are unlikely to be driven by gaps, in maternity leave durations or something like this. Your second question was about including fixed effects. So basically, you should think of like a basic assimilation regression is going to have like an immigrant indicator variable, which gives you like the initial gap between immigrants and natives, and then a coefficient for every other year since landing, which tells you how much that gap is closing over time. And the reason that basic assimilation regression can be misleading is that the composition of workers across these years since landing bins is changing over time, right? You have even within a cohort of workers, you have delayed entry into the labor market, you have selective exit from the labor market, for example, return migration, and you also have like changing composition of cohorts. So new cohorts might be very different from older cohorts, and so all of these loads into the assimilation until those assimilation coefficient makes them difficult to interpret. So I basically interact the immigrant dummy with an individual fixed effect. So every immigrant is going to have their own gap relative to the initial gap relative to the average native. And then those other coefficients are picking up the within worker wage growth or whatever outcome we're looking at relative to comparable natives. And now you're right that now the gap is not identified anymore. All you have is like the assimilation profile. And so I just normalize the gap such that the gap at years since landing bin 10 is equal to the original regression. And it turns out that it's kind of innocuous because the assimilation profiles are really similar in both cases. So if I can just quickly pull up, I can show you the results from these two things. So this is in the black line, it's the assimilation profile that I showed you. In the gray line with circle markers, it's the assimilation if you just have like a sort of really simple one without these worker fixed effects. They're very, very similar. The biggest difference is right at the start where the wage gap seems to like get bigger over time. And I'm pretty sure that that's being driven by like lower skilled immigrants delaying entry into the labor market. So you have like a principal applicant and their spouse. The principal applicant's working right away. Their spouse might need to handle childcare or something while they get their feet on the ground, and then they're entering the labor market later. And so I prefer the within worker one to sort of net out those kinds of things, but in reality, they're quite similar.
Okay, thanks a lot. I was just wondering because in the literature, sometimes what folks do is that they focus on sample of stayers, so you can restrict that, observing the worker for at least 5 years or at least 10 years, and estimate the regression without a worker fixed effect, and that's perhaps a bit more. It's easier to interpret, I guess, the coefficient.
No, you're right. So I'm planning to go back when I have time and the market clears to go back to the data center and add that in. The reason I don't do that is because it's cleaner because you have a sample of stayers, but you're also making a big sample restriction, right? You're focusing on people. You're gonna exclude a lot of immigrants who were not stayers but who enter later, who leave earlier. Cohorts of workers who you don't observe for that full duration. So there's sort of limitations either way, but I would love to document what you just said, and hopefully no results are completely overturned. I don't think that they will be, but yeah.
I think you're doing well. No worries.
Okay, amazing. I think we don't have enough time for extra questions, so maybe we can proceed to close the seminar.
Yes. So just
Thank you
stop
so
the
much,
recording.
everybody.